So good. So you will monitor the chat so I can minimize it, and otherwise I'll just get distracted and stop. Couple of things. So to start with, thank you very much for inviting me to talk. There's one person that is attending this talk who has heard two previous versions, believe it or not, two previous versions of this talk. So I had to change it completely so he is not bored. So Josh, thank you.
I was going to say that's calling me out here.
The other thing is, it is much more enjoyable to talk to a number of faces rather than a number of blank screens. You don't have to turn your video on, but if you do feel like turning your video on, that would be appreciated, and I think I'd enjoy it much more. So thank you for that. So I liked Corrado's visual for this talk so much, I included it on my title slide. What I like about it is, and I'm probably stealing my own thunder here, what I like particularly about it is, whilst I have been talking and I have been fascinating about outcomes for years now, and I've been trying to find a different interesting angle to introduce them. One thing that is quite unnerving about outcomes is you are not in control of them. You cannot make sure they happen. All you can do is do the best and see what happens. So change and chance works really well for me because you have a chance for it to happen, but it may well not happen, and we will come back to that. Okay, no questions so far. So very quickly, this is who I am. I've been around for a while. I'm not going to go through any of this apart from to say that I'm a founding partner of Biliminal, a collective of experienced coaches, and that my proudest badge of honor is the It Depends Certified Practitioner, which entitles me to answer all of your questions with it depends. So let's see how that works as a real consultant, right? Okay, so I used to start these talks with a rant. The rant about being overworked and focused on work and outputs and not knowing why we're doing any of that. And I got a bit bored of that, so I decided to start with a story, despite of the fact that you probably all know this story. So the legend says JFK was visiting the NASA headquarters in 1961, and he came across a janitor mopping the floor. So he said, "What are you doing this late? Why are you still working so late?" And the janitor answered, "Mr. President, I'm helping put a man on the moon." The point of this story is the answer wasn't, "I'm mopping the floor," or "I'm keeping the offices clean," or whatever. It was clearly related. I don't know how much of a tongue-in-cheek answer that was, but it was clearly related to the mission that NASA had at the time. And there's obviously loads of interesting things you can read about this. Loads of people have written about this. But I just find it really interesting how, while this has happened, 60 years ago, when you go to our organizations today, and when you ask a question like, what constrains your team's autonomy, which is what we did a couple of weeks ago in a training we did for a large energy company, this is a subset of the answers we got. So why can't your team be autonomous? Because we don't know what we're supposed to be doing. We don't know what we are working towards. There are no clear goals, no transparency, none of that. So in the words of a famous American philosopher, also baseball player, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. Or as I typically look at this and I say, if you don't know where you're going, you will not know when you don't end up there. And it's really important, it's really useful. Again, we'll come back to this. It's really useful to know when you don't get what you expect, because without that, there's no learning. Okay, so just quickly, a couple of definitions. So what is the outcome? According to the Cambridge Dictionary, is the result. It's what happens as a result of your actions. What happens as a result of the output you create. And as I said earlier, you can control your actions, but you can't guarantee the outcome. So any commitment to the outcomes is at best a commitment to do your best. And then I talk about outcome-oriented change. So what's the outcome-oriented change? This is my definition. So this is just making sure that whatever you do or whatever you're planning to do, you always keep in mind what it is that you would like to have happen and for whom. So what is the value you're delivering or you're planning to deliver, and who are you delivering it to? Okay, so with that boring stuff done, let's have a look at, well, how does it work? How does it look like working with outcomes? Any questions at this stage? I mean, it may be a comment, it may be something you disagree with. Please feel free. So, I've already mentioned the best place to start is start with what I call clarity of direction. And I was playing around with this, start with the goals, start with the outcomes, start with this or that. I'm now talking about starting with a mission. And I'll define a bit more what this means in a second. But starting with the clarity of direction, really starting with knowing the answers to these questions. So who is it that we are serving? What is it that they care about? What are their needs? Which of these needs are not met? Which of them are we trying to meet? And ultimately, my favorite clean language question, what would we like to have happen? When we do what we do, what do we think will happen then? An organization I worked with, time is warped with COVID and everything, but probably about 2 years ago, a year ago actually, was talking about the activities as something you do and the outcomes as something that you have once you've done what you did. So what are you going to be left with? What are you going to have? So this is how you could look at it. And I don't want to go into definitions of each of these terms, but if you have your overall purpose, say organizational purpose, that organizational purpose may be broken down into a number of missions, the different parts of the organization, value streams, or however you are slicing your organization. What are their missions? What is it that they are trying to achieve? What is it that they're trying to accomplish? What impact are they trying to make in the world? And then those break into a number of outcomes, and then these outcomes break further into smaller outcomes, etc., etc. A friend of mine talks about the tree of outcomes. It's a nice visualization where you have a purpose at the roots, and then or maybe values at the roots and then purpose as a trunk, and then you go up the tree into thick branches and then thinner branches as missions and bigger and smaller outcomes. So it's really a hierarchy of outcomes, with each of them feeding into the ones above. So can I give you an example of a mission statement? Well, here's one I picked up from everybody's favorite economist, Mariana Mazzucato. So she talks about a plastic-free ocean. So a plastic-free ocean could be a purpose. Getting to or cleaning the ocean from plastic could be a purpose. And then the mission is really much more concrete than that. The mission is about what is it you're trying to achieve and by when. So when JFK talked about putting a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth by the end of the decade, this was 60s, of the last century, for those of you who forgot. That was a mission statement to my mind. So it's almost like a mission is a purpose made more concrete and with a deadline attached. It's very much more useful if it is more concrete. Okay? So there's our mission statement. So we start with a mission in mind. And here's an interesting thing then. So how do we proceed? So the common way of doing things, and this is something that we have been really struggling as an organization, working with clients who invite us to help them achieve something that they want to achieve. They have a view of where they want to end. They have a view of this future end state, or my least favorite term, target operating model. So that's where we would like to end up. And this is where we are. This is our current condition. So any large consultancy would come in and they would do a gap analysis, and then they would produce a plan, and then they would go around implementing that plan. The only problem is that A, you don't know if that end state is what you really want. It's your best guess right now. The other thing is you don't really know how you're going to get there until you start moving. And all of us kind of that have been working and living in the Agile community know this. You need to start moving before you start learning, kind of thing. It's very difficult learning by just sitting and analyzing things. So this gap thinking is really problematic. And there was a really good tweet by John Cutler and a longer post by Jay Bloom, who was talking about ideal present. So another way to do this, and the picture probably explains it reasonably well, is where are we now? What are we going to do next? Which step? Which is the first step that is going to take us to a better present? There's another term used for this, adjacent possible. What would be a good place to move from where we are now? So Kanban method talks about starting with what we're doing now. So this is kind of it. So when Jay Bloom talks about ideal present, he really devises what we should be doing by figuring out what we would need to do today to deal with what he calls a present mess, what we'd need to do today to avoid the future mess, and what we'd need to do today to make the ideal future more possible. Not to get there in one jump, but to start moving towards it and make it more possible. So to our mind in Biliminal, you cannot implement, come and help us become more agile. You can't do that in a traditional predict and plan way. The only way to do that is by experimenting and adapting. And this is what I will continue describing. Any questions or disagreements or comments or anything whatsoever, suggestions? There's a couple of things in the chat. I have no idea what it is. Yep.
So I would say it's a bit like a musician. So people that want to learn a tune on the guitar can learn the tune, but they don't need to know the theory. But you can go out and use the tune, and you can take part in concerts, band practice, get the things that are important.
Yes, Zach, and maybe an even better analogy would be composing a tune.
Composing slightly different because you do have to understand the theory behind it before you can do the composition.
True enough. I'm just thinking if you're learning the tune, there is a description of the tune. There's kind of a fairly clear picture of the desired end state, and that's not where we are most of the time.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. So yeah, but I like what you're doing. The method's known as Suzuki teaching or Suzuki learning, and that sounds lean, so people buy into it.
So, starting position. Oh, yes, Sergey.
Yes, I have one comment or question. I don't know. I really liked your question. Start with direction. I really liked your list of questions because currently I'm working with one of the organizations who is some kind of hybrid between agile and classical waterfall. It's transition period. And they asked us to start new project area. And we had some discussions, disagreement with the management. First, they asked to start the topic, to study the topic. And my question was why we want to do this change, why? And they said, no, let's start by what we can do, let's study the scope. And after that, we'll estimate, we split it on blocks, estimate and take a decision what we want to improve in this area. And my comment, and I think it's the same in your question, it's we have to start with the target and not with the area.
So we have to start with the target, going back to what Zach was saying, or how I interpreted what he was saying. We need to start with the target, and we need to be humble enough to know that that may not be the right target. And the only way to find out is by having a go at it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my message. Okay, so
start without target, it's a mess, it's something crazy.
Well, it's just practically not particularly clever because your learnings will be, you won't be learning as much.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions, Corrado?
No, not Dragan. Actually, there was just the comment about the musician, but there was not a question.
Okay, sorry, I'm not going to be dragged into. I was thinking about something else to say about musicians, but yeah, let's leave that for now. Okay, so the first step was start with a mission. Second step is, and this is probably the biggest difference to the previous version of this talk. I used to say start with a big goal and then break it into smaller goals and then break them into smaller goals, creating something that in the charity sector they call theory of change. So if we have this happen, then we may have this happen, and then we may have this happen, and ultimately we'll have the impact we want. And then you measure everything all the time. This is a slightly different approach, and it's kind of going back to this idea of present thinking and having incremental steps from the present. So if we know what the mission is, then we need to start generating some insights. And the questions that would be really useful to ask are, okay, so if that's our mission, if that's the impact we want to accomplish, make to the world or whatever, what is stopping us from fulfilling our mission? What is holding us back? So those then are the tensions that Peter Senge talks about in his fifth discipline, creative tensions. So we pull towards the mission, but there's also something pulling us back towards the current state. What are those tensions, and which one of them would we like to act upon? So the next step is really choosing which of these tensions to do something about. So this is now exploring options for action, exploring options to improve the current present. So choose what to act upon, and then articulate the desired outcomes by creating a hypothesis. So what do we do by creating a hypothesis? We're linking what we believe is a good, useful, valuable action or actionable change or output. We're linking it to what we know, the insight, as well as what we desire to accomplish, the desired meaningful outcome. So due to this knowledge or this insight or this highlighted or recognized tension, we believe that if we do this particular thing, it will result in this particular outcome. But this is not enough. This is an incomplete hypothesis. What you need is like in every user story, and all of you that have worked with user stories, you know user story is not complete without acceptance criteria. So how will we know that we have got there, and how will we know that we are getting there? So I call these indicators of success. So we'll know we're successful when we see these things, and we'll know we're on the right track when we see these other things. I tend to believe it's useful to have a combination of lagging and leading indicators, because by the time you get the lagging indicators, it may be too late. You may have wasted time that you could have steered and done something. Okay, so you put together a hypothesis, you link these things together, and now what? Well, the next step is really the core of this cycle of kind of outcome-oriented change. It is designing experiments, designing and running experiments. So this is where this approach becomes really hard and disciplined. It's not, oh, we'll just try this thing. It is really, well, what are we going to do? And what do we need for that? And what are we assuming? And what are our dependencies? And who should be involved? All of that kind of stuff. And there's a bunch of templates you could find on how to design experiments on the internet. There's a couple here. One's the test card from Alex Osterwalder from his value proposition design. And the other is from Mike Burrows from his Agenda Shift book. There's a bunch of others. So as you can see, there's a hypothesis here in both of these, but there's also a bunch of other things that are helping make this experiment much more concrete. Okay, so again, there's a balance of spending too much time on designing experiment and rushing too early in executing it. Okay, so then you run the experiment, and once you run it, you get some outcomes. And then you need to ask yourself, well, what did I expect to happen? What did actually happen? What's the difference? Is it the same thing? Is there a delta between the two? And what does that tell me? What have I learned? And then informed by that new learning, what could I do next? So again, Alex Osterwalder has a learning card, which is the kind of flip side of the test card. So we believe that this would lead to that, would result in that. What we observed, what we learned, what we observed is the following. What we learned from that is the following. What are we going to do now? Okay, how much sense does that make?
Hey, Dragan, there are a couple of questions.
I was pausing deliberately, yes.
Yeah. The first one from Caroline, I think. Caroline, can you unmute and make your question?
Yeah, sure. Just around the choosing options from insights, just because I'm at that stage at the moment. I'm doing a workshop where we're kind of discussing options, and we're sort of looking at, you know, asking them about how feasible it is, what's the importance and what the impact is going to be, to kind of assess what ones we're going to prioritize. But I just wanted to know if there were any other criteria you would look for or you would ask them to think about.
Well, I suppose to start with, how do you evaluate? So depends on how many options you may end up with. It may be blindingly obvious what you should be doing, but there may be dozens of things you could be doing, because there may be a large number of tensions your organization is experiencing. So you really need to find a way to prioritize, either by prioritizing those tensions, what's holding you back the most, or prioritizing the desired possible outcomes, what would be of most value. You probably can't do both. Maybe you can look at both at the same time. But the key thing is, with all of these things, the key thing is not to spend too much time deliberating and analyzing and planning, but to know enough and to have enough clarity to start moving so that you can see if you got where you wanted to get or not. I've no idea if that helps a lot at all, Caroline, or not.
No, that's really helpful, because I think because it's kind of multi stakeholders as well. So I think they're going to obviously have their own priorities, and some of them are external to our organization. So I think, having a think about those two options as well and asking them, that will be helpful to get everyone kind of on the, the same goal, I guess.
Yeah, what is really common, what I find very common and very stressful, is that people come up with, we need to do X.
Mm.
And there's hardly anybody in the organization who can explain why that should be a good course of action, why that's a desired change. So when you've done it, so I suppose the coaching skill is to ask the question without annoying the hell out of people. Ask the question, so when we get that, what happens then? In other words, you're asking why we're doing that, why you're suggesting we should do that, but ask it in a much more, in a much gentler way. And when we have done it, what does the world look like? What has changed? Coaches have this weird habit to use present tense for the future to make it kind of more here and more tangible. So maybe you can try that as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
And
thank you, Dragan. There is a question also from Zach. Zach?
It's just on the whole thing about hypotheses. We see them coming up more and more these days. And what people fail to do is run the idols on it. So the hypothesis was put forward by Sir Francis Bacon back in the olden days, around about 1600. And what he said is, when you make a hypothesis, you should ask yourself 4 questions. What does it look like from my tribe, i.e. my team? What does it look like from my past experience? What does it look like from the marketplace? And what does it look like from the theatre, i.e. the spin that can be put on it? I think it's valuable to do those so that you've got ideas from other places. And then the other bit that one should always do with the hypothesis is apply the dialectic. So from the hypothesis, you then bring in the antithesis. And by looking at the two of them, you come up with the synthesis, which I think is what we're doing in workshops. But you don't need to have a workshop to do it all. You can do it by yourself if you know what you're doing.
That's really interesting, Zach. You also made me think, there's somebody waiting in the waiting room, Corrado, a latecomer. You just made me remember one thing, which is, if you look at the scientific method, if you look at the scientists in labs doing experiments, they put hypotheses together all the time. But the key thing is, they don't create hypotheses to prove them right. They create hypotheses to prove them wrong.
Indeed.
It's like testing, right? The fact that we haven't found a bug doesn't mean the bug is not there. So the fact that we haven't proven hypothesis wrong doesn't mean that it is right, but it stands a higher probability of it being right. But the very act of articulating it is really useful, as long as you then don't do everything in your power to prove that that you're right. It is genuinely being humble enough to admit that you could be and probably are going to be wrong, and there's nothing wrong about that.
Because
so
two
really
wrongs, because 2 wrongs make a right, yeah?
Well, maybe, or many wrongs make for lots of learning.
Yeah.
Okay.
On the other point of value, there's a way of looking at value 5 ways: customer, strategy, which is investor, operations, team, and self. And with that, they can be used in workshops to be able to get that overall view of the different shareholders, stakeholders that are involved, and gives you a most valuable job first. We should have a chat offline.
Yeah, and in the kind of more hard-nosed financial organizations, People talk about 4 dimensions of value. The value, the revenue, new revenue generated, revenue protected, cost reduced, and cost avoided. So this is very, very financial, but it's still useful sometimes. So again, you could look at your outcomes and prioritize them that way, or the way that Zach just mentioned, looking at it from 5 different perspectives. Okay, so that's a bit more input to Caroline, I suppose.
Indeed. The other one there is Silicon Valley Product Group. They have quite a few dimensions.
Right? There's a lot. The thing that is frustrating and really exciting is there's so much knowledge around this, and this leads into all sorts of different directions. Anyway, moving on. So we design experiment, we run experiment, we get the outcome, we then figure out if that is what we expected, and if it's not, then we see what we have learned from that, what we can learn from that, and then decide what to do next. So we follow up, we validate, we navigate, and we go around this cycle really as quickly as we can. So when I first jotted this cycle a few years ago, and it has changed a bit, but the key things have stayed the same. It has been inspired by the Lean change by Jason Little from his book. I think he has 3 stages. I forgot those 3 stages. I've created 4. There's all sorts of different versions of this, but this is the one I have been using for a while now. Another thing that is probably useful to point out here is that this applies to the mission that involves the value you want to create for your customer, as well as the mission of improving your ways of working. So you could go around this cycle trying to improve your ways of working, your how, in addition to or instead of improving your what, the value you deliver. There could be 2 supporting cycles of change. Okay, so what else? So don't forget what we said at the beginning, which is your goal, your target may not be your target anymore once you started moving. So you really need to start thinking about, well, what did we think about? What were we thinking when we started the journey? What have we learned since? Are we still aiming at the right thing? Should we persevere towards that mission, or should we adjust our direction? So nothing is sacred. There's no reason why we should blindly continue following in the direction, even or despite all the learnings. Okay, so that's pretty important. So I don't know if you're going to be disappointed, but I have cut down the lots of different stuff that I had here. I have a couple of final thoughts. So I keep on arguing about outcomes with one of my partners who keeps on saying outcomes just lock you in. His knowledgeable term is they reduce your optionality. And I argue that as long as it's like the strong opinions lightly held. You just need to be clever about how you work with outcomes to avoid locking yourself down. And to that, I'll give you an example of a, God forbid, roadmap. This is the outcome-based roadmap, as I see it, as I call it, where we work in periods that are short enough, maybe the quarters, maybe the months, they're probably not longer than quarters. And for each of these quarters, we have a different level of detail that we have worked out. So for the current quarter, for the period or quarter, for the current period of time, we have committed to the outcomes that we want to accomplish. We have committed to the outputs that we would like to create to help us to enable and support those outcomes. And we have the clarity of the indicators of success. So we will know when we are successful. Equally importantly and usefully, we will know when we are not successful. Okay, so we've done some work, And we have committed. We can't commit to outcomes. We can commit to do anything in our power to accomplish them, but we can't guarantee them. Okay? So that's the current period of time. That's what a friend of mine introduced me to, this concept of ice. So it's frozen, it's solid for the current period. But you know what? If the fire breaks out, it will melt. So it's solid until it is not anymore. But we keep it as solid as we can. Sorry. For the next period, we have planned what outcomes we would like to go for and what outputs are most likely to help us accomplish them. But we're still fluid, and what we planned might well change. And that's the message that needs to be communicated, back to what Sergey was saying earlier. That's the message that needs to be communicated to the stakeholders who want to know what you're going to be doing and what you're going to be achieving in April next year. Okay? We should not lock ourselves in longer than whatever the shortest period of time that makes sense in our context is. And then beyond that, it's all aspirational. So it's probably useful to say we will aim for these particular outcomes, but we don't know. It's all up in the air, right? So ice, water, steam is a really good analogy. And like ever, as ever, you're trying to strike the balance between clarity and the sense of control that a lot of stakeholders are craving. And so clarity and control on one side and flexibility on the other. Because the longer you lock yourself in, the longer the period that you lock yourself in, the less able you are to respond to whatever comes back. Any learnings, any feedback, you just plow on regardless, which is not a particularly good thing. So where's your balance? How long can you afford to be locked in? How long can you afford to commit to? It will depend on your context, but my guess is the shorter the better. There's lots of comments. I have no idea if it's just showing to me.
No,
Anything
Dragan,
interesting
there are
about it?
just a couple of links that I put in the chat.
Okay. And the final thought, actually, there's a bunch of thoughts.
I have a very quick question regarding
Yeah, sure.
previous slide. You put indicators only for the current period, not for the next one.
Yep.
Based on my experience was in a particular situation, when we started to discuss the future, we started to ask the question to the management stakeholders why you want to do it and how you will measure it. But it really changed mindset. So we started from the beginning, output plus how we will measure it with numbers. And do you have something special why you put only for now, not for the next or not?
I suppose what I'm trying to show here is that I'm limiting the amount of work done to plan the future. So indicators of success, you do need to, well, I suppose you could say, well, we're always going to measure the same things. We're going to measure, I don't know, customer retention, net promoter score, whatever are your standard KPIs. But these may not be your standard KPIs. They may be very specific to the outcomes you want to accomplish. So the more into the future you go and you try to be more specific, including the indicators of success, bluntly, the more waste you are creating.
Okay.
So again, it's a balance. But again, see, every question brings some kind of memories. So I worked with the organization where they wanted to be more product rather than project and more outcome rather than output. So that was the stated desire. They really, really struggled to get the people on the ground to actually get away from reporting how busy they are and start showing what the results of that busyness might be. So they would have things like in the current quarter or in the current period, they would have preparing for something that they would accomplish in the next period. And, you know, they would just have a bunch of things that were not outcomes. They were not really, they couldn't be qualified as the meaningful outcomes. And you could not get them. It was a real struggle to get them away from showing how busy they are. Because if they were to have an empty box on this roadmap, all hell would break loose. Somebody would come down on them and say that they are idle or they're not pulling the weight or whatever. So it took them good year and a half to 2 years to actually start reporting on genuine outcomes. It's really interesting to see how long it may take.
Yes, for us it was at least half year just to start to be able to identify indicators.
Yeah, just the language is, you get it. I always say you get it here, you don't get it here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so people, it's all about people. We all know that Agile is all about people. We are talking about future of work that is all people-centric, or we call it people positive, complexity conscious. So the first thing is invite rather than impose. So again, change through you, not to you. Somebody posted on LinkedIn a survey earlier today, I saw it, why people resist change, with a bunch of options. I think people resist change for a number of reasons, but the first reason is they feel the change is done to them. So I know a lot of health professionals working with NHS, so practitioners, surgeons, doctors, they're never asked for their opinion on anything. Everything is decided for them by either the politicians or by the managers, right? So how would you feel about such a change? Who knows the answers? Who is in contact with the patients every day? Who is in contact with the customers? Surely they should be involved in deciding things. So change through people. And something I found resonating, something I kind of thought of is you have a choice. You either invite people into the change, you ask them to be part of it, to make it happen themselves, and if you don't, you are explicitly or implicitly inviting resistance. So people will at best not help you, and at worst actively try to sabotage you. So that's the first thing. The second thing is engage and build ownership. So David Maquette talks about moving authority to the information. So get the authority to make decisions down to the people that are actually doing the work, to the people that are in contact with the customer. So whenever I call, so there's two types of customer service I have experience of. Okay, I'm simplifying. But example of one is, say, American Express. You call them, you have a problem, the person you are talking to solves your problem. 90% of the time they solve your problem. They are capable and empowered, they have the authority to do whatever needs to be done. And then there's customer services or call centers where people can't do anything, they just keep passing you around. So which ones would you rather be? Which ones would you rather work with? And when I did a retrospective with a big program of one of my old customers, the biggest learning, the biggest feedback that came back from the people on the program to the management was, give us problems to solve, not solutions to implement. So give us the what and why, don't tell us how. And when we come up with how, support us. Don't tell us, oh, well, you can't use that tool because, I don't know, central IT hasn't approved it or whatever. Okay, and finally, enable and support. So what can help the change happen? Nurture those conditions. So it's almost like going in front of the train and laying tracks, or going in front of the car and kind of cementing the road. You are putting in place the conditions to make change, desired change, more likely to happen. And when people talk about motivating people, it is not, and you've heard this hundreds of times probably, it's not about putting a tennis table in the office and, I don't know, foosball or whatever. It is about asking people what is holding them back and then doing something about it. So I've come across a really interesting interview by the CEO of Roche Pharmaceuticals. He's talking about when he became the CEO of one of the parts of the company. He went around and spoke to lots of different people and asked them what they thought about the company and their work. And they were pretty much all saying the same thing. They were saying they love the company, they love the culture, they love the values, they can't get anything done. So the bureaucracy was stopping them from doing anything. So he then set out to, as he calls it, smash the bureaucracy. So it's a really interesting interview if you can come up, if you can find it. Actually, Roche YouTube channel interview with Gary Hamel. So the CEO of Roche talking to Gary Hamel about what happened to Roche and the experiences Gary Hamel had with working with organizations. Really, really interesting. And that's it. And this is who we are. So we fairly recently came up with kind of our purpose. We are here to help you get good at getting better. So
thank you, Dragan. Yeah, there is a question from Sean. Please, Sean, if you want to unmute and make your question.
Maybe.
Okay, I can read it. Maybe there is an issue. What do you do about resistance when you encounter it? Just accept that you can take everyone with you?
It's a good and difficult question to answer. Try to find out where it comes from, what's the reason. I mean, you will never be able to take everyone with you, but it's not only your responsibility to deal with resistance. I mean, as external consultants, coaches coming into the company, you need to find internal people who will help you navigate. Mm-hmm. But the key thing is understand, it's ask questions and listen.
Okay.
People will be, but I always remember one particular person, an experienced project manager, telling me that it's all the same crap. This agile thing, it's all the same crap as before. So people see it the way, I mean, you need to understand their mental model, their kind of view of the world, and then maybe you can start having a conversation.
Mm-hmm. There is a logistic question, actually, the following one from Christina. She's asking if there is a chance to have the deck that you use for the presentation, a PDF copy or something.
So I will send you the PDF and you can post it. I've done it before.
Perfect. Yes, you can send to me and I will put the link. Perfect. Yeah. Thank you, Christina. And Andrew has a question. Andrew?
Hello.
Hello.
So I'm very interested in what you have to say because I used to go to quite a lot of events like Product Tank, where this kind of working with hypothesis nature was quite often used and your experiments are quite often used. But how is there a crossover? So if I had, say, a product owner in my team and I was kind of acting as a Scrum Master or an Agile coach in that environment, would there not be some kind of level of crossover with that, in terms of how you would approach that? I know that you would be looking at it from the point of view of helping the entire company, but is there kind of a logistical issue there? Do you understand my question?
For whatever reason I'm struggling, I almost jumped at the answer, but I'm not sure it's the right answer. So what do you mean by?
Well, I'd say, yeah,
it might be. It might be my connection is
Can you
bad
just
today.
try to re-articulate it? What did you mean by is there a crossover? In what way?
Okay. What you're describing is what historically I've understood is partly the role of the product owner to look into hypotheses, to work into experimentation, to look into more of an outcome based. Is there maybe a clash of cultures if you're coming in there and describing this kind of lean thinking, and that's kind of how that would be sort of defined by what the product owner's roles and responsibilities were? It might be a strange and a dumb question. I just kind of was. It's very inspiring what you're saying. It's just that in my head, it's always been the product owner's job to actually do what you've just sort of been talking about.
Well, depends on what you mean by do what I'm talking about. So as a Scrum Master, as a coach, internal or external, you would be bringing the method.
Okay.
You'd be bringing the context, if you will. You'd be explaining the approach.
Mm-hmm.
It's still the product owner's job to come up with the content. So you're not the expert on that particular product, maybe not even the expert in the organization. I've just started working with the medical devices company. I know nothing about what it is that they're doing. So I could bring this approach, but they will have to come up with, they have the insights. They will have to come up with the outcomes they want to accomplish. They will have to come up with the meaningful actions that may lead to those outcomes. They will have to come up with the indicators of success. So in the same way that a product owner traditionally in this kind of software world and broader would need to come up with user stories, or at least kind of the core of the user story, the product owner, or I really like the term, the name of the role of outcome owner. So when you get a product, what is it that you have accomplished? What is the result that you have achieved? What's the benefit you have delivered to the customer, whoever your customer might be? So I really like the outcome owner rather than the product owner, but same thing. So they would have to articulate the what and the why within your how.
Yeah.
Hopefully that makes some sense.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much.
Yeah, there are more comments in the chat about the resistance, and there is a question from Zach about has anyone used the lean scenes yet? I never heard about lean scenes. Really curious about that.
Yeah, what we've got is a discussion about process change, but the product people are getting confused. So when you have an internal story that takes into account all your different stakeholders, of which there will be 5, you create an internal story, which is like a scene from a play or a movie. And therefore, what you find is that there's a protagonist, and the people who are resisting are called the antagonists. And as you develop the story, you turn the antagonists into fellow protagonists. And it tends to line up with the narrative arcs that come out of anthropology and storytelling. And I think it's pointing to a change in the way that we will deliver systems. But that's a topic for another day. But a lean scene is essentially, instead of looking outside to the customer, when we're trying to do change for outcomes, it's more of an internal thing for a project. So you usually have the team, operations, and strategy, and that allows you to plan a small initiative, which will take about 6 weeks because you need that for your brain to change. And then you also put in 1-up and 2-up planning so that you know that you're aligned with what it is that the people at the top want. And from that, they then come in and give you top cover to take out the desktop snipers that are applying resistance.
So do we have time for me to make another point about resistance, Corrado?
Sure.
So in answer to resistance and following on to some extent from what Zach was just saying, so how do you deal with resistance? So the resistance is the result of a certain belief, right? So people have beliefs and their beliefs are different than yours. And that's why they're resisting what you're suggesting. So how do you change beliefs? The only way to change beliefs is through experiences. The only way to change experiences is by doing something, trying something out, trying something new, trying something different. So when you're dealing with resistance, one of the ways to deal with resistance is to agree to try something. It may fail, it may work, it may not work, but you know what? We can afford to do it for a few weeks, maybe 6 weeks, maybe 2 weeks. I don't know what it is, whatever the relevant period of time is. Ideally, the shorter, the better again. Let's try it out. See what happens. And maybe something happens, maybe that will create an experience that will challenge their existing belief that is at the root of their resistance. So maybe we just agree to disagree and still agree to try something, to have a go at something. Look, it's only going to take X weeks. And whichever way it turns out, we're going to learn something valuable. Let's try it out. Now, the problem there is that some people have aversion to certain words. So some people don't like the word experiment. It sounds too scientific, or it sounds too like, oh, it's going to fail. So maybe use a different word. I don't know, whatever it is, pilot, or I've recently seen the word, wayfinder. So finding the way. I don't know, whatever you choose to do, choose something that's not going to rub people the wrong way and get the buy-in to try it out, hopefully with genuine involvement of all parties involved, because they would be keen to prove you wrong, right? Let's try it out. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe who cares? It's getting beyond wrong and right to what's useful to all of us, what's valuable to all of us. I'd strongly believe that most ills in the world are caused by people wanting to be right and prove others wrong.
Yeah, then also about changes, actually, we don't know what is right and what is wrong. So,
well, no, and say that at the beginning. We don't know. Let's just try it out. Now, who asked about resistance? Does that in any way help with that question?
Yeah, amazing. Okay, we have time for just one last question. If someone wants to take the opportunity.
Have you enjoyed yourself, Dragan?
Yeah, that question doesn't count. Well, having in mind that this is a Josh would be able to say how different this is. I've no idea. I feel it's rather different from the previous version of this talk I've done. But it was my first go at saying some new things and saying them in slightly different order and different ways. So I enjoyed it. Josh?
I would say it was, yeah, I would say it's a lot more refined and very, very enjoyable to listen to, as always.
The rest of the people are thinking, God, how was the last one then? If this is refined.
I didn't see the previous version, actually. So for me, it was new. And there are a couple of very interesting thoughts that I found. I took a note for that. And so from my side was really, really interesting and helpful. And I hope that also for the other. We had roughly 30 people joining, so not really bad. It's a good number. And obviously you are invited to our next session also. I set during the conversation a few links on the YouTube channel and on our newly created LinkedIn group. So we start this year, we started to create a copy of this community, of the Meetup community also on LinkedIn. That is probably a more modern tool, just for your information, but we will continue with Meetup. I have to say thanks a lot, Dragan, for sharing this. We will be in touch for the PDF of the deck that will go directly in my, let me say, folder of the interesting changes topic. So thank you very much. And thank you all for being there and also for make this session so interactive with all of your questions and comments. Really, really, really engaging session. So I'm very happy of this first session of the new season. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Zach, keep in touch. I take you on board. Keep in touch.
Yeah, I've signed on to the LinkedIn group.
Perfect. Thank
So
you.
if you want, I did talks on this last year at AgiNext and one out in Berlin. So I've got a deck that we can go with.
Perfect. Yes, yeah. For the others, we had in the meantime a conversation about this Lean scenes. So we will see if we will be able to arrange an event just on that with Zach. So you see, new opportunities of learning for any of us. Thank you very much.
Super.
Thank you.
Dragan.
Thanks, Dragan.
Well
Thank
done.
you.
I really love it.
Cheers.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.